So what do you get when you combine a Celtic knot with a valet tray? Something really cool. That's coming up. Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Reitz. This is Weaver Leather Supply. Today, we've got a great little project for you. It's gonna have a very professional finished look when we're done with it, and even a beginner can do this. If you've got a basic understanding of how to run a swivel knife and how to work a bevel, you can totally do this. So we're gonna start with our prep steps. And if you have any questions about how to do the prep steps, we did a video on it not too long ago, so we'll put a link in the description for that. But at this point, I've already cased the leather, I've traced the pattern onto the tracing film, and now I'm using a stylus to move it over to the leather. So a quick question for you here. How many of you are interested in seeing a video on how to case leather? There's a bunch of different ways to do it. They all have different steps and processes, wait times, that kind of thing. And if you're interested in seeing something like that, let me know in the comment section below. But as far as the project goes, we're gonna be doing a lot of tooling on this as far as beveling, and that kind of thing can really stretch out the leather. So make sure that you don't forget to tape the back of your project before we go any further. Otherwise, this square is not going to be very square when we're done with it. So now it's going to be time to go ahead and round off those corners, and I'm going to be using some of the corner knives from Weaver. These things simplify the process so much. But if you don't have one of these, that's okay. One, you can order them from Weaver, and two, you can use your razor blade, like a box cutter, and just create a lot of straight cuts, and eventually you'll be able to round that corner off. But get you one of these when you can. They, as you can see from the video, they really simplify the process, like a lot. So one thing I want to mention real quick while we're tracing the pattern onto the leather. This project is a multi-layer project. And what I mean by that is we're going to be using multiple pieces of leather, stacking them together to get the look that we want. This is our pattern. And what we want to do is we want this main portion right here to be one piece of leather. This inner portion right here needs to be on a completely separate piece of leather, and it needs to be bigger than this main portion. The reason for that is we want some overrun here so that when we put them together, we can trim it and get that perfect crisp edge. So make sure that this and this are on two separate pieces of leather, and this one is on the larger of the two pieces. So now we got the corners rounded off. The next step's gonna be to bevel the edges of the project. We wanna give it that nice finished look. Now, I call these a bevel. A lot of people call them an edger or an edge bevel. All of those are correct. I've always heard them called a bevel, but that can get kind of confusing with the bevel that we use for tooling. So bevel, edge bevel, or edger, that's what this is. First thing that we're gonna be doing is we're gonna strop it on a strop board just like you would your swivel knife. Now you don't have to do this every single time you use it. I've gotten in the habit of doing it every time I use it just because it hones that edge and it makes it so much easier. But I would say every other time or every third time you want to make sure that you strop the edge on your edge bevel. Now, why do we even need to bevel the edge of our project? Well, one, it feels better in the hand. Two, it gives it more of a professional look. And three, those sharp corners where it's the corner of, or like the edge of a project, or it's the actual corner, those tend to be high friction points and they can really wear and distort over time, which really shortens the life of your project and it'll make it look a lot more worn and old. So we want to edge and round off those corners so that doesn't happen. With that done, we can go ahead and cut in the design. Now, I know when you look at it, it looks kind of complicated, right? The reality is, it's just a bunch of slightly curved lines. There's no tapering to it. So even a beginner should be able to do this, especially if you've used a swivel knife once or twice. Now, I know I bring this up in every video when we talk about a swivel knife, but it's really important that you don't connect the cuts. We want them to get really close, but we don't actually want to connect the cuts with the swivel knife. We'll do that with the bevel in one of the next steps. Here's a quick little tip for you. As you're running those straight lines on the outside of the project, drop your pinky off the side of the project and put it right up against the edge. What that's going to do for you is it's going to give you one more indicator as to whether or not you're running straight or maybe you're starting to drift a little bit. So before I forget, if you're enjoying the videos, if you're finding them helpful, do me a favor, click that like button. It seems like I always forget to ask this. Tells me, tells YouTube, tells Weaver that we're on the right track and you want us to keep making videos like this. Now with that done, we can jump back into the project and the next step, which is beveling. So this next step can be really frustrating if you're still learning how to use a bevel. But if you'll apply some basic principles and stick with it, I promise you'll get the hang of it. Now, there's two main things that are going to affect the smoothness and the effectiveness of your bevel. The first one's going to be how hard you're striking the top of the stamp with your maul. Now, it takes very little pressure if your leather's cased correctly to get the impression that you want. So we're going to keep that pretty minimal. You can adjust a little bit if you need to, but it's a pretty minimal strike. The other thing that really affects your smoothness of your beveling is the amount of overlap that you have. And really, you want to have about a 50% overlap. And what I mean by that, if this is the foot of your bevel and you put the first impression in there, we don't want to jump over here and hit it again and then jump over there and hit it again. What we want to do is we want to have about a 50% overlap between those two so that we're really smoothing it out as we go. That's going to be a lot more difficult with the smaller bevels. So my tip to you is to get the largest bevel you can, the largest one that will fit in the area that you're working, and use that one. And then when you need to, drop down to the next smaller size and keep doing that until you get everything beveled. So work with the largest bevel you can that will fit in the area that you're working. So you might notice that I'm using a checkered bevel here. The reason I prefer a checkered bevel is because that texture that it adds to the pattern holds antique better, which helps create shading and depth. So as we're beveling the pattern, how do we know which side of that line to bevel? Well, there's two questions that I'm going to give you that's going to help a lot with that. The first one would be, are you trying to raise or lower the thing that you're beveling? And what I mean by that, we can either raise it and bring it into the foreground, or we can recess it and push it back into the background. And one of the ways that we can do that is if you're beveling on the outside of the line, it's going to lift it and raise it. If you bevel on the inside of that line, it's going to push it back and recess it behind everything else and push it into the background. Now, with this particular pattern, we're going to be raising and lifting everything. So we're going to be beveling on the outside of all the lines. The other question that I would give you is, what's on top? And this question right here is one of the main reasons that I picked a Celtic design. As you look at the design, you'll notice that everything kind of weaves in and out. And that makes it really simple to tell what's on top. It's great practice for figuring out where to bevel, how to tuck. So your two questions are we raising or lowering? And the second one is, what's on top? With leather tooling, one of the big concepts that you need to get your head around is really simple, is pushing and pulling. We've been talking about so far about how we've been pulling the Celtic design into the foreground by beveling on the outside of those lines. The background needs to be pushed back into the background. One of the ways we can do that is matting. Now for matting, the technique that I like to use, you may have heard me talk about it before, it's something that I think of as nibbling. And the reason I think of it as nibbling is the stamp nibbles away at the background. We're going to use the leading edge of that stamp to nibble away and compress the background. The remaining part of that stamp compresses and smooths out the background so we get a nice, smooth, consistent texture. In fact, we've got a clip here from one of the videos that we did a few months back that really shows really well how to use that leading edge to nibble away at the background. The next step is totally optional. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab my modeling spoon. I'm gonna use one of the curved ends to round off the edges of all that vine work, that knot work that we just created. By rounding it off, we're gonna give it a little bit more of a domed shape, which is gonna give us even more depth. But like I said, that step's totally optional. So tooling the main design, we're done. Really all that's left is the die, the assembly, and a little bit of paint. But we need to be able to cut out this window right here. And to do that, we need a fresh blade, dampen the leather a little bit, and take your time. We don't want to leave the sharp corners on that window that we just created, so we're going to grab our edge bevel and round them off real quick. So this main design right here, it's done, but we still have this center design right here that we need to take care of. We're gonna do it pretty much like we did the first design. We're gonna trace it, cut it in, and bevel it. So that box around the basket weave has a lot of very close lines, which can make them really hard to bevel without smashing everything flat. So I'm going to be using my modeling spoon instead of a traditional bevel. I'm just going to snug right up against the lines and gently bevel down that leather. So the tooling's done, you can relax now, you can breathe, the tough part's over. Really all that's gonna be left is color and assembly. And for the first part of the color, what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna dip dye everything black. Now, if you're not familiar with dip dyeing, first of all, it's super easy. Number two, Chuck did a video a while back, a fantastic video that really details how to dip dye things. I'm gonna refer you over to that video. We will put a link in the description so it's really easy to find. But for now, I'm just gonna dip dye everything black. And when I say everything, I mean the main design and that bottom piece that has the second design on it. So we want to create some depth in that window that we created. And to do that, we're going to be adding a welt. Now, what's a welt? A welt is essentially a spacer. The easy way to do this is just to add glue to the back of the main piece, then put it on your secondary piece and let it dry. Now, one thing I'll point out is that secondary piece is bigger than our main design. That allows us to cut it away and get a really nice flush edge. The other thing that you might notice is that the second piece hasn't been dyed black yet. And that's because most of it's going to be cut away. So why dye it? Now that we got that done, all we need to do is grab a dauber and dye the edges. So when you're working on a project like this, a lot of times the order of operation can be really important, and this is one of those times. With a situation like this, if I were to take that top design and the welt that we just put together and add it to the bottom design now, we would have a really tough time slicking this inner edge without damaging the bottom piece. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and slick it now. You can either use gum trag or token oil and your slicker. Gum trag is gum tragacanth. We'll put a link in the description. They're both slicking agents and they both work really, really well. But let's go ahead and slick it now and then we can assemble it. So now that we got that done, we can go ahead and start assembling everything. And to do that, we're gonna be gluing it together. This thing's really not gonna take a lot of friction. It's not gonna be bent. It's gonna sit on a dresser or something like that and hold your keys and your wallet and your purse. So we really don't even have to stitch it. We just need a glue that'll hold really well. And for that, you've got a couple of options. First is you could go with Bard's contact cement. Bard's contact cement locks it together and it's not coming apart. The problem is you got one shot to make sure that center design is centered in that window. So for that reason, I like using white glue, specifically Fiebing's Leather Crafter Cement. That's going to lock it in nice and tight. It's not going to go anywhere. And it's also going to give you the option of adjusting that design to make sure it's as close to perfectly centered as possible. Once we got that done, we can go ahead and dye and slick the edges. I'm going to be using wax as one of the first steps in burnishing those edges. And the reason I like to do that is because it really helps bind those fibers together and create that glassy look that we all look for. The downside to it is waxy surfaces tend to be kind of sticky. So after we're done with the wax, we're going to want to go back over it with either tokonol or gum trag, which is going to get rid of that stickiness and really finish off those edges for us. Now you can stop right here and have a beautiful project, but we like pushing things a little bit further whenever we can. So to do that, I'm going to be painting the design with Fiebing's 18 karat gold. And this is really simple. Essentially, you're going to stay in the lines, go slow, and do 2 coats. So if you're one of those perfectionists out there, and trust me, I understand your frustration, I'm one of you, I've got some really good news. Your lines don't have to be perfect. The next step is we're gonna be antiquing the entire project, and that antique is gonna settle down in those low spots and really clean up your lines. So you want nice clean lines, but don't make yourself crazy trying to get them perfect. We've got everything dyed, we've got it painted. Now we want to lock those colors in to make sure that they don't go anywhere in the future steps. And to do that, I'm going to be using aerosol leather sheen. This is great because you don't have to touch it, and that means that none of the color is going to lift off. So this is one of those steps that's really tough for me to do in studio, mainly because you don't want to be breathing that stuff. So what you want to do is take it outside, go over it with 6 to 8 coats of leather sheen. And when I say 6 to 8 coats, I mean really light so that they're basically dry as soon as they hit the leather. Let it set, air out for a few minutes, bring it back in, and you're ready to go to the next step, which is antiquing. So I'm going to be using Phoebe's Antique Finish, black, to antique the whole thing. Once we've got it antiqued, we're going to buff it off right away using a flat cloth. Now the reason we want it to be flat is so that it picks up the antique off the surface, but not down in those low spots. As you're buffing the antique off the project, you're going to want to pay special attention to that corner where the floor meets the window. That's a really easy place for antique to get trapped, and it'll make your project look really messy. So pay a little extra attention to that corner right there and make sure that you don't leave any antique behind. Once you've buffed it really good, you want to set it aside for about an hour or so and really let the remaining antique set in and lock. We want it to sit down in that antique and not go anywhere, because in the next step, what we're going to do is we're going to grab tan coat or whatever sealer you like the best and lightly go over the top of it with that sealer. What this is going to do for us is two things. Number one, it's going to lock that antique and color in there so that it doesn't go anywhere. And number two, it's going to brighten up the whole project. Antique has a tendency to dull the colors, and by going back over it with that tan coat, it'll brighten the whole thing back up. With that, you've got a beautiful, professional valet tray that anybody would be proud to own. That's going to do it for this video. I will see you in the next one. In the meantime, go make something amazing.